So I'm going to maybe just start by asking, I think this is, well, it's a question for any of you. It's difficult because you'll all be aware of this, but to explain to us what is the kind of conventional, if there is a conventional, what's the conventional sort of pathway of how capital flows to take, okay, I've discovered a molecule in the lab, I'm an academic working somewhere, I've discovered a molecule in the lab, and now it's potentially, I see a signal that potentially it's important, and now I have to, eventually it becomes a medicine that comes to a patient. How does capital flow? Should we start with the research, how the research is funded, and then to the next stage of the process? So maybe Jayne, you could start with.
Okay, I think that the trickiest part of financing innovation is probably that point where an innovation looks like it has promise, where there's protectable IP, where it could be developed forward into a treatment or a test. And there are a number of mechanisms for accessing that funding. There can be continued academic funding through public or third sector. There can be collaborations with industry, or sometimes academics choose to spin out into small companies. And one of the most problematic points for financing is that very point of spin out, where you're looking for validation, optimization, scale up, and that is, I think, the most problematic part of the pathway for financing innovation.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Jakob, any part of the pathway you want to?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think Jayne makes a really good point that's really tricky when you've got an interesting hypothesis drug and you want to get that seed funding to start that company. That can be tough. It's particularly tough right now, I would say, in these economic times. But once you get beyond that and now you've initiated your company, then there can be other mechanisms for getting funding and continuing to go forward there, where there can be venture capital funds like the one that I just started working for, where we will invest then in the early or that next phase when you're going from early preclinical data towards an IND filing, towards those early clinical trials, phase 1 and 2. We tend to focus very much on those drugs that are in the clinic that are leading toward those clinical experiments where there could be proof of concept to really show that this is a medicine that may make a difference for a patient. So that is what is this round of private funding, which is termed Series A, Series B, Series C, which is before a company goes public. And what can happen then is a company, as they get further along, and particularly these days, as they generate compelling data, they could opt to go public and do what's called an IPO, or initial public offering, or a merger and acquisition can happen where larger pharma companies can come in and say, this looks incredibly promising, we'd like to bring this into the company, and then take it into those next big trials, the phase 2s, the phase 3s, and the post-approval. So there is sort of this flow of activity.
Right, and again, I know many people will be aware of this, but those who aren't, it sounds to me as though if I come up with something, there's several stages where I'm going to have to go out with data, with a begging bowl, and go, okay, I need some cash to take it to the next level. Rajan, what kind of levels of cash are we talking about, or any of you actually? But Rajan, at each of those stages, what's the kind of typically level of investment? Let's say it's an immunotherapeutic or one of these cancer drugs that we're talking about now.
So we use a small molecule as an example, which is
okay.
Probably the least complex thing to manufacture.
Okay.
So you'll end up with a scenario where you have to file your IND and you have a few $1 million expenditure to get there. Once you get to your IND, your first in human studies range between $5 and $10 million, depending on how many patients you then have to dose. At some point, you have to invest in your manufacturing capacity and capability as well, because you have to take your molecule and scale manufacture. If you can make 20 grams in a lab, it's very different to needing to make a kilo or 5 kilos at scale. And then you go into your, let's call it proof of concept and efficacy studies, often labeled phase 2, and you can be spending anywhere between 10 to 25 million at that stage. And that's the cost of actually running your trials, doing your manufacturing, dosing your patients. What it doesn't take into account, though, is the additional spend that has to get spent on the drug when you have to go out each time and raise money. So if you go out and raise money after you've got your toxicity safety data to allow you to go into first in human, your spin-out then raises money ideally from a VC because you have a long-term investor. So there's an exchange of capital that allows the spin-out financier to leave the show, if you like. So that capital doesn't go into growing the asset. When you do your phase 1, you get to another set of data, and you get, okay, it's safe, toxicity profile's great, we've got a little signal of efficacy, and then you need to go out and earn some more money, or raise some more money, to fund the next stage. And at that point, you'll get someone who comes, usually buys out the initial investor, maybe a small cap VC is replaced by mid-cap VC, or there's a little exchange at that point. And again, the money that's invested to go to the next stage of development is probably about the same amount that's used in the buyout as well. By the time you're licensing or selling to pharma with proper proof of efficacy, decent amount of scale manufacturing, you might be looking at a ticket price of 200 million plus, but you've spent 45 to 50 million, half of which goes to exit players along the way. So not value creation.
Right. So there's evidently your point is perhaps inefficiencies in the conventional pathway. We can explore those. I also want to explore the relationship. There's several things that I think are interesting. The relationship between academia and particularly with the European focus, I think, the effectiveness of the relationship between academia and spinning out or creating value for people who've invented or discovered something in academia and how that works. I'd also like to compare Europe on a global stage. I mean, because it's clearly good for the economy of Europe that we are stimulating innovation and having that basis and having capital flows which are stimulating innovation. So there's all of that to discuss, and I'm open to questions from the floor as well. So let me start with maybe that relationship between academia, and maybe Jayne, you're the best to speak to this one. Or?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that there are billions of euros and billions of dollars go into academic research, and it does generate this potential for innovation. Yeah. But the majority of that potential remains unrealized due to lack of early funding. And if we look at that pre-seed space, and I'm talking really about the validation and optimization, where you start to build the case for later investment, the amount of cash available to that has fallen by about 50% in Q2 2023 compared to 2022. So what we're seeing is a lot of opportunity, a lot of companies forming, and then a lot of companies failing to gain the resources that they need to develop their innovation. So, for example, a spin-out might have to cut itself very lean. It may target to one specific indication. It may only have one item in its pipeline, and that just creates a very, very fragile ecosystem. Right. And part of what I wonder is, do we have quite right the investment model to enable those companies to thrive and to understand the real potential for applying their innovations?
Yes, because you need a kind of multiple shots on goal, especially with a new molecule or a new discovery, to optimize. But that takes money to experiment, to do those experiments.
And one bad outcome can mean your prospects of investment are gone.
Yeah,
and
I'll come to you, Roger. Yeah.
And maybe just to comment further on that, I think you're 100% right, Jayne. And there is this connectedness between the whole ecosystem, which goes from academics, early seed funding, venture, big pharma, and so forth. So what's happened these days is, and there has been the shift where we look at the decrease in funding and seed from last year to this year. It's absolutely true. And part of it is also driven by the back end, because if you think about it, what big pharma is looking for, they really want to find assets that are quote-unquote de-risked, which means that they're much more likely to succeed. And that means that there is less of an appetite right now for really risky hypotheses and things that may not actually work out. And so that ends up impacting the beginning of the process too, that if you've got a really novel idea and something that's really, that there isn't a lot of evidence for yet that this is going to work, that there's relatively less appetite there. But, you know, this is such a constant kind of flux where if you go back 3 years ago, there was a lot of investing in seed concepts. So I think it's the nature of this ecosystem is that we're in a period of a lot of risk where there's more appetite to go after de-risk hypotheses and drugs.
Right.
But then there are going to be other times when there's much more appetite for novel innovation. And we are seeing some deals where Big Pharma is starting to do some platform things. Genentech did a thing yesterday with a molecular glue company to sort of augment their portfolio. But it's constantly shifting, I think.
I guess there's a time lag, because if you've got a dry pipeline at the beginning, it takes a while for that dryness to hit the end, and then you go, oh God, we better invest in some high risk stuff again. Right. Okay, Rajan, you wanted to?
Yeah, no, I think we need to look at this slightly differently. And both of my esteemed colleagues are 100% correct. The system is lacking in capital at the moment, and you have a lot of assets stuck. But I think we need to consider what happens if we don't spin out every potential molecular discovery. If you do a spin out, you have to have a company. Company needs expensive C-level management. It then needs an operating infrastructure, which means the investment that goes into running that infrastructure doesn't go into value creation in the asset. So if you didn't spin out every asset, but you licensed it to specialized development organizations that weren't pharma, for example, whose role it was to, let's call it, compress and absorb and manage risk, you can create a scenario where you can properly fund a drug's development with two very key endpoints. Number one, you get that de-risked compound, you've got scale manufacture and the pharma wants to buy, meeting that unmet need. But two, you have an opportunity to return some of the value proposition back to the originating scientists. Right? So rather than spinning out into a company and that scientist and that group or that academic institution being diluted over serial fundraisers, where their ownership of the drug becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, you can create a scenario where, and we've done this out at Ellipses, where you have a scientific, let's call it an asset originator, owning 10% of the downstream economic returns of a drug. If it's successful, the value, we know what a value of a successful oncology drug looks like. You can have that going back to
and that's non-dilutive, so that 10% will go through all the way through to the...
That's correct.
Right, okay.
If I could come on that, that is an approach which is becoming interesting to the third sector, to the charity sector, how they can behave like virtual biotechs and help fund and develop their assets through third parties with a view to having them licensed or acquired. So I think that is I don't think it's a good thing to suppose that the only route, as you say, to developing an innovation is through spin-out.
Completely agree. And I think the other two things that we need to sort of address is not just additional models of getting the drug out of the academic institutions, how do you fund them? The stochastic nature of funding in bits is value erosive because it takes time. You take time away from ultimately the valid patent life that pharma needs to have to sell their drug. The longer patent life that you have, the less the risk is transferred to pharma anyway. So funding properly, we save 2 to 3 years comfortably. If you execute your trials, design them properly and execute them properly, you can save another 2 to 3 years. And we had a conversation yesterday where there was some thoughts about patent life, patent reform, just extending patent life by 5 years. But the implications, of course, must, in my opinion, very dangerous. If you go the other way around and save 5 years in development, you don't need to change legislation. You'll have an extra 5 years to sell exclusively.
Right. Yeah.
I just want to comment about one other aspect.
Just get the iPad, so I've left
about where we are these days in terms of company building and so forth. And I do think there's still an appetite to fund really good science and really good ideas, you know, and people have spoken about the IPO market being dried up, but we are seeing that begin to open up, and there are some companies that have really great data that are now able to go out and go public. So, you know, great science and great data will certainly win the day, I believe. But what's also happening these days is that with the earlier ideas or the earlier companies, I think there's a lot more rigor also from the investment side to say, tell me again how this works. Tell me what the clinical trial is that you want to design. tell me how you're going to show proof of concept. Show me what your regulatory strategy is. So there's, I think, a lot more intensity in that process, which I think is actually good, because if you've got your act together on those elements, you're going to be more likely to get funding as well. And that's where, you know, it is a partnership where we on the investment side with the leadership in the companies will actually collaborate and work together and say, well, how can we put this package together where it's attractive for you to fund as well?
I think it's really important to build that in right from the first funding, so that you're understanding your market, you're understanding the fitness to meet the need in your indication, you're understanding what the care pathways look like, what local markets look like, what the key points of value are for your innovation, and to start that right at the very beginning before you even get to that Series A discussion.
And part of the journey to that is looking slightly westwards across the Atlantic and working out that you need a slightly more sophisticated investor base here in Europe. We have a very different approach to risk. We might invest 1 to 5 million. If you go to America, you're looking at a raise between 25 and 50 million to get your company off the ground. There's about 200 specialist biotech investment funds in the US. There's about 7 in Europe. And so that ecosystem needs to be grown, and part of that journey is about educating those analysts and those funds to say there's a better way of appreciating risk, absorbing risk, and then moving the drug through the various echelons. I think the other thing is understanding that a drug isn't a molecule that happens to treat a disease, either in a cell or a human. You still need to be able to manufacture the drug at a sensible cost. Yes. You need to be able to prescribe it, and so you need the help of physicians who will prescribe it. And there's plenty of evidence of good drugs that meet an unmet need, that have efficacy, but won't be prescribed because the profession doesn't want to deliver a drug that way. And then you have to have a drug that patients want to take, and tolerable side effects, but also a tolerable regime of taking it. I'll use a very interesting example of a pediatric oncology drug that failed to get to market. It works, but it requires a 24-hour infusion pump and the child to be in hospital for 7 days. So it becomes an intolerable endpoint for that patient and their family.
So these are potentially avoidable risks that are not due to the scientific uncertainty so much. So what question for all of you is, what do you advocate for reducing those risks in the R&D pipeline, to kind of start ahead of the curve and go, well, will they be prescribed? Will people tolerate? And, you know, at what point do you need to think about these things? Should we be thinking of?
Right at the beginning.
Right.
So Jayne hopefully is going to go and talk a little bit about this. So I'm going to stop talking now.
Well, I'm going to say that's a fantastic reason for working in partnership with charities who know their patient group, they know the clinical landscape, they understand where the unmet need is, and they have that reach through to key opinion leaders and to patients, so that right from the beginning you're starting to de-risk that investment all throughout the chain by making sure that it's patient-centric. Right. And meets the need.
So, go on then.
Yeah, I was going to agree yet again. I think there's another element in terms of how you build a company where you really have to think. We also invest in leadership teams and the people within the company. That's very much how we think about it. So it's also, how has the company thought about the key people within the company? Like, if it's a cell therapy or gene therapy, how good is their manufacturing group and how their regulatory view to that? And that probably needs to be built in very early on. So I think, yes, partnership with key opinion leaders and with academic groups and so forth, but it's also, how is the company thinking about the patient groups? How is the company thinking about the key hires and the key expertise that they need to have? And then there are going to be certain groups on the investment side that have expertise that are going to be more likely to be helpful to those companies. Some will be better suited to help the companies than others, because once we make an investment, we're in it for the long haul. So we can bring expertise to the company to make sure that the right direction is given.
Right. Well, any questions from the floor? Yes. Yeah. Go ahead. We'll get a microphone to you. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned it, that patients, patients, you see, but in quite some industries there is know your customer. And I think one thing that lacks in drug design and development is know your customer. What would happen with investments if patients were from the start part of the design team? Because I'm a cancer patient, I'm a lymphoma, and for sure I would say, I don't want your drugs if it extends my life for 4 to 6 months with a bad quality of life. So design another one. And then a lot of drugs will fail because most cancer drugs extend life for 2, 3, 5 months, cost $60,000, $80,000. So I think it could contribute to society, but probably not too much to industry, when you bring in the customer, patients, in the design phase.
Yeah, go ahead, Jayne.
Just to respond to that, when we set out our priorities for investment, one of those priorities is around, does this reduce, does it deliver, and is it efficacious with reduced side effects? Is it more acceptable to the patient? Does it deliver more benefit? And so starting right at the very beginning with those questions is absolutely our model in terms of how we choose the investments that we make.
But, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think you're absolutely right. And what's happening more and more, I would say, over the last 10, 15 years is the patient voice is being embedded more and more. So you think data safety and monitoring committees on clinical trials can frequently have a patient representative. You can also have, as you're designing your clinical trial and your informed consent, you can also incorporate or have a patient representative so that they read the protocol and the informed consent beforehand. But I think it's a really good point also in terms of what does the end game look like? Are you building something that's going to be attractive or valuable to that patient? And it may have something to do with the dosing regimen, and may have something to do with the side effect, the quality of life and all that. So I think it's something that has been happening more and more and more over the last 10 to 15 years. And I think more and more companies are aware of this. They're even doing patient advisory boards where they'll specifically have a panel of patients with the type of cancer which is being addressed by that therapy to get that perspective as well. So,
and ultimately, as drug developers, drug designers, why are we doing this? We're doing it for patients. So it's naturally you need to be thinking about the individuals who are going to be taking those medicines and the impact that's going to have on them and their families. So it is certainly, I'm sure everybody in the room that's involved in drug development, it's a no-brainer. And so I agree with Jakob. I think the world has changed. We obviously need to and can do better to integrate those views earlier, and protocol design and driving things like compliance and in taking those medicines in those trials. But I also think there's a role to play for, and this is about using technology to our advantage. Modeling in things like pharmacodynamics and pharmacokinetics to see what the impact of a drug is going to have on the body without necessarily having to put it in the patient to test it. Right. Predictive modeling is very important. Understanding things like therapeutic index, what's the window in which you can dose. You can do all of these things without having to dose the patient. Right. And it's very important to make sure that you've done them before you spin out a company or fund a $25 million study.
Jayne, you wanted to...
I was just going to comment that Prostate Cancer Research is able to stay with companies throughout the development process, so even at the latter stages, supporting clinical trial development, recruitment, patient engagement, ad boards and so on, whether those are companies that we invest in or whether they are third-party companies to build those relationships between developers and patients.
Right, okay.
And I just want to, if I may add one more,
Yeah.
We talked about this in our small group, but it's this element of different patient populations. So as we do our clinical trials and we think about developing our therapies, we have to make sure that we have the representative groups. And that's we call it diversity and inclusion in the United States, but that's really an important initiative to make sure, because there are some therapies that can have a different side effect or efficacy profile in certain patient populations as well. So I think that's the other element on the patient side, is not only what do you want, but we have to make sure that the drug works, equally well, or we understand how the drug works in different populations of patients.
So I was interested in what you said, Rajan, about the predictive capability, which allowed, because I was wondering about at what point does a patient, or do you realize that actually there's a narrow therapeutic window, or there's going to be toxicities? I mean, traditionally it's only when you get to at least phase 2, perhaps, that you start getting an inkling of this stuff. And I wonder, given that, traditionally, whether there's structural barriers, because if at each stage there's a new funder that needs to buy out the previous funder, it's kind of not your problem if you're an early stage part of the pathway, because it's a problem for the phase 2 or phase 3 guy to worry about whether a patient will actually take it or whether there's going to be toxicities. So, you've got a structural barrier to be considered, against considering these issues right up front. So, so I just wonder whether that's...
I wonder if actually that indicates that the whole system needs to change, right? In the sense that we've always looked at this in sections: discovery, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, commercialization, and we've funded and designed drugs in that way. But a 10-year closed-term fund as a venture capital cannot design and build an entire drugs development pipeline. I wonder if we have to approach this very holistically, and perhaps Jayne can comment from a prostate cancer perspective. Looking only at prostate cancer is great if you're a prostate cancer patient. But actually, if you were to pool your resources with multiple different research organizations from a charitable perspective, you could take an investment in a portfolio approach and de-risk your entire bang for your buck in that respect. By owning a pipeline, then of course looking at the venture capitalists on my right, you have a de-risked portfolio as well, and you're not going to have every winner, but you're going to have some winners over a shorter period of time. But food for thought, really.
Two things, just to the earlier point. A return on investment is great for us, but actually it's the impact at the end of the process. So we're much more likely, it's central to how we make decisions, is that there should be an impact for the patient at the end. It's not just the exit for us. And then the second point you made was?
It's about
portfolio approach.
Whether a portfolio approach of funding yields a better return.
And just interestingly, a lot of the companies that we've looked at as potential investments for prostate cancers actually could have, they could be in any solid tumour, or they're a platform technology. And what stops them having that breadth of pipeline is really the investment. And so, if there is a strong case for deploying in prostate as an initial target, then that absolutely aligns with what we're seeking to achieve. But you're right. A lot of these technologies could have more than one indication, more than one use.
Yeah. I just want to comment on your therapeutic index concern, and I think it's a real one. I think maybe a couple of aspects to that. One, we know that, the FDA, EMA, they're getting pretty... they are very sophisticated, and so when we're putting our INDs together and so forth, I find that they'll ask for some pretty sophisticated things in terms of preclinical experiments and so forth, and even toxicology things. I mean, I've done clinical trials where you're combining a couple of agents together, or standard of care.
Well established,
And the question has come up, and we've had to justify, are we going to do a toxicology study, a preclinical tox study with both agents, or can you get just do the novel agent? And so I think they're starting to ask for more and more data, or they not starting to, but they are asking for more data. I think another aspect is, and it was described how expensive the drug development process can be, and especially in cancer, as we get more and more targeted, and we talk about targeted therapeutics, there's opportunity to show early proof of concept, even in phase 1 trials. And we all want that. If we can show an active drug, a safe drug, earlier on and get the drug approved much more rapidly, that's good for everybody. And so there's also the impetus to try to understand the therapeutic as much as possible as you get into that phase 1 experiment, because maybe the phase 1 is not simply going to be a safety and dose finding study. Maybe there is going to be opportunity to show early efficacy and maybe, you know, have a path to registration very rapidly. So a skinnier, you know, IND package may not be to your favor in that regard.
I want to change gears a bit and ask you, Jayne, about, we've been talking a lot about sort of innovations in drug, and often when we're talking about it, because of the nature of our conversations, it tends to be around personalized medicines, targeted medicines, although you did speak about small molecules, Rajan. But say things, simple inverted commas, where we've not had any new antiemetics for a very long time. Palliation seems to be, pain relief, sorry, it's the analgesia seems to be, you know, there's opiates and that's about it. Yeah. You know, these things have remained thus for decades. How do we incentivize innovation in those really, you know, patient-centric areas, but there's just not a lot of interest from capital markets?
That's right, and things come in and out of fashion also.
Yeah.
So, you know, if you have a good prospect in immunotherapy, you're probably going to have less trouble accessing finance than if you're looking at some palliative medicine or if you're looking at a diagnostic, because it's perceived that the returns are less certain or lower. Yeah. So I don't know what the solution there is other than this model of patient-centric investment right at the very beginning to try and de-risk some of those investments, to try and support them through commercial advice, clinical advice, and access to infrastructure so that they are more attractive to the later stage investors. I don't know if there is another solution.
Yeah, or even inventions that don't, or innovations that don't really have an IP basis. And maybe that's not what we should be using. Capital markets is an instrument in our armamentarium for patient care, and maybe it's the wrong instrument for that kind of activity. I don't know.
But we heard from Eileen, the very first patient voice this morning, about the holistic patient journey that one needs to have. If we treat a patient as an ecosystem rather than a disease that we have to treat, there's a potential to address, let's call it the diagnostic and then the treatment direct elements, but then the holistic elements around the outside, such as pain relief, such as psychosocial well-being, such as understanding that there's everything from naturopathic through to cannabinoid elements to help with well-being, mental wellness, but also physical pain. Understanding that ecosystem that surrounds each individual, and it will be individual and personal for each patient, I think is really important. It's not necessarily a drug developer's role, but it's certainly from an investment ecosystem. Digital tools exist that you can use to try and give people access to it. In fact, Mike, sitting in the audience, hopefully, from the cancer platform, we're seeking to sort of create that digital infrastructure to allow patients in that ecosystem to have a sort of a digital signposting shop to credited and validated information.
Well, and I guess, I mean, yeah, just riffing on that, I guess, you know, we've just had this thing about value in the health system. I mean, it's in the innovator's interest, having brought something to market, that it is actually used where in the real world it delivers value to patients. And that's only as good as the pathway that surrounds it. So I guess there is an interest. There ought to be an interest from innovators to kind of extend themselves to make sure that their innovation is used correctly.
Agree. But my point being that you don't necessarily need to invent a new analgesic or a new antiemetic. There might be things out there. You just need a new way of accessing it and making patients aware of it.
Yes,
which is why Prostate Cancer Research in April this year launched a major new initiative called the Info Pool, which helps patients find in a digestible form information about their treatment options, symptoms and side effects, and enables them to make informed choices and have the right discussions with their doctors. And also on this point of data, we recognise that it's not just money that makes an innovation successful. It's access to expertise, but it's also access to data, and in some cases access to samples. And for this reason, we're in the feasibility stage of a major data platform that will help support translational and clinical research in the future.
Right, and that may make the whole R&D pathway a lot more efficient if that data is available to innovators.
Yes.
We've got about 5 minutes left. Any other questions from anyone? Yes, Mark?
Thank you. This is excellent discussion. I just want to take it back a little bit. In terms of predictive modelling and calculation of risk and of value to patients, has AI got any part in this? Looking forward, is this going to help at all? Are we going to?
Yeah.
Will we have enough data to be able to feed it in and then say this is going to be the probable result? You will be able to do this, but the patients won't want it because it only gives them an extra 2-3 months, and they'll be hooked up to a machine the whole time, and they'd rather go off and see the islands of Greece.
So yeah, so bringing that question to the capital issue, do you see AI and are you exploring AI as a way of reducing capital requirements and reducing the risk along the R&D pathway?
Completely.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
And perhaps a future where there's in silico trials and also intelligent interrogation of data through AI and machine learning, will help to accelerate and de-risk investment and accelerate development of innovative products. Definitely.
I think that's right, and it can really happen at a number of stages of the drug development process. You can use AI to figure out, like, if you want to make a really targeted therapy that's maybe perfect for targeting a particular mutation in certain tumors, you can use AI to do that modeling. I mean, we're sequencing more and more tumors and really identifying new mutations so it can help you rationally design, the drugs. But then also predictive biomarkers, as you're saying, where you're more likely to give a drug to a patient who's going to benefit from it. So again, that should be value add. And again, the big data of identifying those predictive biomarkers, that's certainly AI as well. And I do think, and we touched on it a little bit more, but if you look at population data, where more and more real-world data in terms of how cancer patients are doing in the community with standard of care, we talked about it at our table, but this concept of synthetic control arms, where maybe you don't have to do a randomized control trial because you've already generated data in the community from thousands or tens of thousands of patients, and you can only run the patients on the experimental treatment and compare it to that historical or that synthetic control. So I think AI can really fit in, or big data assessment can really fit in so many different places here.
So obviously, I completely agree. I do think it's worth making the distinction between AI, ML, machine learned, but also predictive indices and modeling, which is not quite all artificial intelligence. One of the key things that sits across all of that spectrum is the quality of the data that you use to generate the algorithms you then make decisions on. I won't use the expletive, but rubbish in equals rubbish out. And currently the entire ecosystem is fragmented across both public and private elements. There needs to be an aspect of where some of this data can be pooled and shared, but also accessible in the right format and databases that allows decision making to then be evidenced to right the way through development to the regulator at the other end. Otherwise, you make decisions, you then are going to have to validate it in the clinic to generate the data to produce for the regulator, because there's no pull through from the quality of the data that you use to make your decisions on.
Jayne, anything to add to that?
Other than I totally agree that having good quality, unfragmented data is definitely a prerequisite to success.
Excellent.
All right, we explored a lot. I'm sorry, Robert, we're pretty much out of time. Maybe you can catch them afterwards, if that's okay. So apologies. I would have also liked to explore what you'd like to see happen in Europe from a governmental perspective or from a policy perspective to accelerate that innovation landscape and to make R&D more efficient. But again, we're out of time. I'm so sorry. So thank you very much indeed. And yes, Robert, please do catch them to talk to them later. Thank you. All right. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.